Thanks everyone for joining. So as Dawson said, my name is Stephanie Ng, and my capstone project was with the Bluff Lake Nature Center in Denver, Colorado. So just to give a brief overview of kind of what I'll be going through over the next 45 minutes or so, just an introduction of Bluff Lake Nature Center itself as an organization and as a site, some of the background and its social ecological context, going through the two main activities that was a part of my capstone project, as well as a little time for reflections and Q&A afterwards. So just as a brief introduction, Bluff Lake Nature Center is an urban natural area dedicated to environmental education and really environmental stewardship. They do this through a range of educational programs like summer camps, in-person virtual field trips, the Denver Forest School, which is an outdoor focused preschool, as well as a lot of other opportunities for learning like service learning projects with corporate team building, having junior naturalist camps, science speakers, and really just a multitude of events and programs throughout the year. It's also a great space for outdoor recreation, being really in the middle of Denver, or I guess technically towards the outskirts of Denver. But there's really an incredible amount of flora and fauna to explore, really clearly marked trails and space for recreation and just gathering. There's also a really strong community of bird watchers and naturalists that come to Bluff Lake pretty often. And the organization itself hosts a lot of different events throughout the year for, birders to gather and build community, different holiday events, even wine and cheese nights, and some guided relaxation walks. So just a little overview about the history of Bluff Lake. So the land was originally owned by the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes before European settlers came. Really over the next 100 years or so, the land changed hands between a number of private individuals and estate owners, and was eventually purchased by the aviation department to begin construction for the Stapleton Airport. Just a clarifying note, so within the past maybe 1 or 2 years, Stapleton actually changed its name to Central Park. So later on in the presentation, I will begin referring to the area neighborhood as Central Park. But anyway, so after the Stapleton Airport closed in 1994, the Sierra Club actually launched a successful lawsuit against the Department of Aviation for inadequate retention ponds that led to ethanol glycol, which is a de-icing chemical for airplanes, which polluted the waterways and led to some fish kills. So after that lawsuit, or as a result of that lawsuit, the Bluff Lake Natural Area was established in '94, and eventually its management was passed on to an organization that kind of came out of the community, which was Friends of Bluff Lake. And they really have been, were in charge of site maintenance and natural resource management on the site for really a number of years. Eventually, the site was established, or the organization that is today, Bluff Lake Nature Center, was established and became a nonprofit organization, and really has been in charge of running and managing the area for the past couple of decades, and officially got ownership from Denver's Department of Aviation in 2008. So today, Bluff Lake Nature Center is still there in a nonprofit organization operating really Denver's largest private park in the area. So a little bit of background, more the social ecological side. So Bluff Lake is a 123-acre area in the city. There's kind of a nice view if you've never been there before. But there's quite an impressive amount of diverse habitats and species within the area, and it provides space for food, water, and shelter for wildlife, and acts as a stepping stone within a city of really fragmented pieces of green and natural space, and is particularly important for migratory birds to rest and nest within the area. and it has a 9-acre lake within, which is Bluff Lake, within Bluff Lake Nature Center, and also has Sand Creek kind of running through the northeastern portion of Bluff Lake. So just a bit of the social context and kind of orient ourselves within for where Bluff Lake is in Denver. It is that blue spot in the middle of the map there. And this map outlines all the different zip codes kind of immediately surrounding Bluff Lake. And you'll notice that there's, a pretty big difference and disparity between median incomes for these different zip codes, especially from this one, which is the 80238, which is Central Park, and the one that Bluff Lake resides in, and its neighboring zip code down here. And there's a number of other kind of socioeconomic indicators that really demonstrate how different each neighborhood is, but all to say that it is kind of in the center of and attracts visitors and supports communities from really a number of varying socioeconomic backgrounds. And this area in particular has experienced a lot of change and growth and development in the past decade or so. You'll notice here in this kind of highlighted box, that's more or less where we are. And it's had some of the biggest increases in the Denver area in terms of housing. And this is really mostly new construction and new housing, which has led to really a huge increase in population and kind of changes within its population composition. So there's just been a lot of movement and development with, in the area immediately surrounding Bluff Lake Nature Center, which definitely has huge impacts on the site itself, as well as the visitors that come into the site. So a few of the kind of unique considerations. Some of them are challenges, some of them are just things to think about that make Bluff Lake unique in terms of a management perspective. They have an issue with the prairie dog population. According to Bluff Lake staff and this organization, as the development has kind of happened right outside at the border of Bluff Lake, the prairie dogs essentially escape to inside Bluff Lake because it's kind of this oasis with really unlimited food in their eyes and really protection from kind of all the construction development that happens outside. So they have just kind of increased in population in the Bluff Lake area, which and there's really at the moment, they consider an unsustainable number of prairie dogs, just with the number of prairie dogs per acre that they've found. And the issue with the prairie dogs is not only potentially depleting some of the food sources and vegetation if there's too many, but also they're burrowing in the numbers that are there, really can put the structural integrity of the ground, lead to a lot more erosion, and potentially lead to some impacts or destruction of city property kind of on the other side of the property line. So there are some kind of interesting management implications and things that they've had to do to deal with the prairie dog numbers. They've also had a dam reinforcement back in 2016. And that is where they constructed a new 1,100-foot slurry wall that was built behind the dam on the north side of the lake, and to slow the leakage from the lake. And they also had some money to recontour the bottom of the lake. And after this, after the dam reinforcement was complete, they noticed some of the cottonwoods in the cottonwood grove immediately next to the dam, their health started to decline and kind of has continued to decline over just the period immediately after the dam reinforcement. So actually a previous CLTL cohort conducted a tree survey to try to understand to better understand how the dam impacted the vegetation kind of in the immediate surrounding areas. So the tree survey was conducted within the Cottonwood Grove to identify different tree species, as well as kind of the health and conditions of the trees within that area. There's also the stormwater outfalls in Bluff Lake. So there's a couple, the lake itself receives stormwater runoff. And there are these kind of green grates here to filter out the big debris and litter and garbage that can come in from the stormwater as well. But luckily the wetlands are very healthy, and the cattails are kind of there to help filter out some of the water so that it can be really replenished and feed into the lake itself. But they typically have volunteer crews to help regularly clean up the garbage, and they also have kind of informational posts and signage right next to the outfalls to kind of inform the public on why that might be there, as it can kind of be an eyesore, and if you're not aware of what's happening, can get some kind of negative perceptions of the management of the site. And another kind of unique consideration, something that they're dealing with now, again, not necessarily a bad thing, but they did have a 47% increase in visitors in 2020. So this is a really big number or big increase in visitor numbers in the past year, and they do anticipate the numbers to continue to increase. And this just poses some, management considerations and how to deal with the growing number of visitors who come to site. And so when I was discussing this project or the capstone with the executive director of Bluff Lake and trying to understand what it was that they need, we spoke about some of the previous work that the cohort did with the tree survey, as well as, conducting some online visitor surveys, which was done online because of COVID restrictions at the time. But, at the end of the day, what they really said they needed was just anything that can get them more data. And of course, I really believe that data collection and monitoring and making decisions based off of empirical data is incredibly important. So we're trying to think of ways to kind of get more data for Bluff Lake to help them inform management decisions really for this project. And so the project goal ended up to enhance their capacity for data collection, monitoring, and making data informed decisions through two main activities. The first one was to conduct an in-person and online visitor use survey to better understand visitor demographics and preferences and kind of what they do or why they're there. And the second one was to assess the monitoring needs of Bluff Lake and come up with basically a plan for incorporating community science monitoring into to support Bluff Lake in monitoring their species and the health of their property. So we'll begin with a little bit more detail on the visitor use survey. And this survey had three main objectives, as you'll see on the side there. One, to understand kind of, or get a better picture of who is the visitor or who comes to Bluff Lake, to understand some of their motivations, like why they come to Bluff Lake and where they go once they get to site, and gather some of their opinions on potential facilities renovations that Bluff Lake has been considering for future kind of fundraising events. And this was conducted in person as well as online. The in-person surveys, actually both surveys were both in English and Spanish, both the paper and online versions, and it began at towards the end of July through the first week of September, I believe. And so for the in-person on-site surveys, this was conducted by myself, and I would typically go on site for about 2 to 3 hour periods at different times of the day, different days of the week, just to try to get a good variation of, morning, afternoon, kind of early evening time visitors. And we also handed out little flyers that you'll see in the top right here with the QR code for the survey if they wanted to do that online, or if they didn't have time to kind of fill out the survey in person there, as well as had that QR code posted at the entrance with a drop box for additional paper surveys if that's what they wanted to do, or taking it whenever it's convenient for them. But overall, for the analysis, I only included surveys that were at least 50% complete. And overall, we got about 54 completed surveys, which really, because each survey was for each group, there's probably that accounted for about 128 visitors. And so some of the just kind of preliminary questions, I won't go through every single question that was on the survey, but for the most part, thinking about what their principal motivation was, pretty much almost everyone was there for kind of enjoying the outdoors and nature and getting exercise and fitness. I will say there's probably a lot more visitors who were there really for the main purposes of exercise or fitness that weren't captured within the survey, because those who are running and jogging aren't really in the physical state to want to stop and take an in-person survey. So there were, based off of my observations, a fair number of visitors who would have been there for fitness or exercise that weren't captured. Most people get there by car. There's a pretty well-established parking lot as well as really lots of parking spaces around the area. Pretty varied in terms of the times of the year, how many times they visit. Again, I will say, just based off of observation and from being there, there's likely more people who are there also several times a week, who are there kind of on a regular basis for fitness and jogging and things like that. But typically they stay a little less than 2 hours, which I think is a good amount of time to explore the space. And when we asked them about these different options or potential for facilities renovations or program additions, these we came up with based off of things that Bluff Lake had been thinking about, based off of their experience. Some of it came directly from previous surveys for visitors or kind of clients before that. So we asked each visitor to rate their preference for these additions or facilities or program additions from a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not important at all, and 5 being extremely important. And overall, you can see there's a pretty even spread. There's not too many skewed kind of on the extremely important side. And I think for the most part, everyone, there's no kind of extreme in terms of one question got mostly 5s or one got mostly 4s. They were generally relatively even. So I think the only ones that kind of were more important were probably permanent bathrooms, certainly drinking fountains, and additional shaded areas, which I will say it would be interesting to see in other seasons. A lot of the days that I was there surveying in person were really hot and really sunny, several days that were 100 degrees and not a lot of people there to begin with. So I'm sure that had a factor in kind of how they responded to this particular question. A couple of locations that they visited. So we asked them to mark, basically gave them a map of Bluff Lake. And this is pretty similar with a few less landmarks to the map that Bluff Lake distributes, broadly to their visitors. So hopefully it was, just made sense in terms of orienting themselves. But we had a list of locations and just asked people to check off all the locations that they visited. And not surprisingly, most kind of go there for the primary loop, which is kind of this big loop from the entrance around the lake and back. And most people kind of do that loop as well as go to the boardwalk to visit Bluff Lake itself. And some of them go off into Sand Creek, which is a little further out, but not really by much. We also asked them to, check and list up to 3 locations that they just enjoyed the most. So what parts they liked the most. Again, the primary trail loop was a very clear favorite, followed by Bluff Lake itself, and the boardwalk is pretty much on par with Bluff Lake, I think, just because they kind of go hand in hand. But also another really big attraction was the nature play areas. They have these kind of play areas typically made out of tree stumps, or the teepees are made out of branches and natural materials. And during the survey, so we didn't include it specifically on the survey, but it was built in kind of the grand opening of their newest kind of nature play area, which is kind of a big nest at the top of Bluff Lake Nature Center before you go down the ramp into the area itself, but to give you like a bird's eye view, more or less like you were in a nest. So that was a new one. And that kind of went into the nature play area as well. And so a few of the visitor demographics, not surprisingly, because it's within the Central Park zip code, and it did align pretty well with the demographic information from that zip code. Predominantly white or Caucasians, about 74% self-identified as such. With kind of a sprinkling of other races and ethnicities. About 55% had a household income of over 100,000 a year, which is pretty much on par with kind of the demographic information from kind of earlier in the presentation. This is actually a very well-educated kind of number of visitors. The majority have some kind of advanced degree and at minimum a bachelor's degree, so pretty well educated kind of population coming to Bluff Lake. And the ages ranged from 22 to 76 with a mean age of 44 years old. And about a quarter of the visitors surveyed were residing in the 80238 or the Central Park zip code, with a sprinkling from these two, which are pretty much immediately next to Bluff Lake as well. But there is actually a pretty wide variety of zip codes, and that you'll see kind of on the right here. And you'll notice, there's a couple that come from a bit further out in Denver, and we also had several respondents who were actually out of state from the Midwest or from the East Coast who were just there visiting friends or family or on vacation. So a couple of recommendations specifically along the lines of the survey. One would be to continue in-person surveys. I think in-person surveys do kind of gather, you can get respondents that might be like not have as strong opinions. I think that those who kind of, get the survey online are just a bit more eager to fill things out, might have stronger opinions. But when you're kind of there and really proactively asking people to complete a survey, you might get a wider variety of respondents in terms of, those who are kind of more neutral and probably wouldn't have filled out a survey if someone hadn't come up to them and asked them. But also doing surveys at different times of the year. Again, there are a number of kind of weather factors that would have influenced some of the survey responses, particularly in, like with water or shaded areas that might look very differently at different times of the year and different seasons. But also, in regards to the facilities and programs additions, I would also recommend, this was only 54 survey responses, so certainly recommending doing more surveys to get how the community feels about some of these ideas before actually implementing anything, because these are kind of costly endeavors, especially with, you know, any kind of infrastructure improvement inside the site. So certainly would want to, you know, get a better foundation of, or better sense of what the community actually wants, because maybe some of those infrastructure improvements, they don't actually want the space to be more developed. There actually was a comment on the survey kind of warning against overdeveloping the inside area of the site. So, and then also thirdly, and I know this is something that Bluff Lake continues to do and continues to work on, is to do some targeted outreach in neighborhoods, you know, outside of that immediate zip code or area. And so a few of the kind of neighboring zip codes that are really close by, but they just don't tend to get as many. It doesn't seem like there's as many visitors from those neighborhoods, even though they're very close by. One respondent, actually chatting with her after the survey, mentioned that she kind of lives in the Montview area, which is very close, but none of her kind of immediate neighbors or friends within that area seem to know about Bluff Lake or have ever heard of it, but she kind of has been frequenting Bluff Lake for a number of years. So the second activity was creating these guidelines for how to integrate community science into some kind of monitoring activity. And basically, this resulted in a document that just provides kind of the framework for and ideas for integrating community science into further data collection or monitoring. And this really focuses a bit more on the ecological monitoring or ecological components of the site. So a brief overview of kind of the issue that this was trying to address. There are a number of threats to the site itself and the site's ecosystems and species. But they've seen really a dramatic increase in visitors that can exacerbate certain current threats. But they're, you know, being a staff, I think, of 6 full-time people, there is limited capacity among the full-time staff to regularly collect data for monitoring. And this really came up, I think, as the more urgent need for monitoring kind of the health and progress of some of the species and ecosystems within Bluff Lake came up with a grant that they received after the dam reinforcement. A part of the grant is to kind of restore the certain portions of the lake, but with the grant requires monitoring of the area, including monitoring and reporting on the vegetation and the species within the area, and supporting all of that with, you know, photo documentation to, you know, view the progress. So they didn't really have a lot of systems in place to do that, and I think that kind of and not really having a good kind of baseline set out really had Bluff Lake thinking a bit more seriously about trying to gather more data of the different kind of species and ecosystems within Bluff Lake. But all that to say, there were a ton of opportunities because Bluff Lake has thousands of visitors that visit regularly, a super strong naturalist and birding community that comes, as well as a lot of volunteer groups from corporations, but also just different kind of field trips, student groups, kind of boys and girls clubs, Mile High Youth Corps, AmeriCorps. So there really is kind of a lot of human capacity that does come to Bluff Lake. So just a lot of opportunity to tap into their interests and expertise and willingness to volunteer. And it's also, you know, a great opportunity is that it's easily accessible. It's in the city. It's easy to get to. It's not, has a lot of good potential for educational opportunities like community science. But it's not, you know, an hour away where you have to drive into the mountains to actually contribute to some of this work. And so to kind of build some of the goals and monitoring indicators, I followed the conservation standards framework, which is really a framework and a process to help you with adaptive management. And particularly within an urban environment, I think adaptive management is really critical to help manage some of the complexity and uncertainty that happens because there's so many different confounding factors that can impact what goes on within the site itself. And in order to adapt, monitoring is really a foundational component of that. You can't quite understand how to pivot or how to change what you're doing if you don't monitor different key components and really have empirical data to show, how a certain activity has impacted, various species or ecosystems within the area. And so to kind of like have a goal to work toward, I outlined a vision which is really closely tied to the current vision of, having a site that one is ecologically healthy and viable, but promotes outdoor recreation and kind of environmental stewardship. And this vision is based off of not only the current vision and goals, but also some of the tentative goals that Bluff Lake has been outlining within their new strategic plan. So they're currently in the process of finalizing a new strategic plan for 2021 and onward. And those 3 bullets are some of the ones that I think could really be addressed through incorporating community science into their monitoring processes, really increasing an understanding of the site as a scientific resource. I think that's just would happen with the general data gathering and analysis, but also providing a lot of opportunities for community to be involved with at Bluff Lake, and enhancing the campus and site, I think overall, and finding that balance between, development, but also maintaining the, kind of health and integrity of the ecosystems within the site. So I won't go through all of these in detail, but kind of one of the first steps I took to assess, what to look at or what to monitor was assessing the different threats. And there are a number of threats like housing development surrounding the area, but most of that has actually already been accomplished, or for the most part in the immediate surrounding areas. But there are, with the high visitor volumes, and especially within such a small site, within an urban area, really disturbing the vegetation. It's not really like in one of the big national parks where, I think the impact is much more spread out. Everything is a bit more condensed and kind of has a bigger impact. So if there are high visitor volumes, who go off trail often, they can do some damage to the vegetation on the area with foot traffic. And also if they're not cognizant of best ways to observe wildlife, they could get too close and eventually kind of permanently scared wildlife away from the area. And this would be critically important, especially for, making sure that we have a good space for, say, migratory birds to nest and kind of stay within the area. So there's a good amount of space for threat of human disturbance. And another potentially higher threat would be invasive species. Again, just a lot of things can kind of come in and out of the site being in an urban area with a lot of human presence. And there's just higher probability or possibility of humans and animals bringing in seeds from non-native species or plants or invasive plants arriving through wind dispersal as well. And so again, I won't go through this entire thing, but this is based off of the threat analysis and kind of just conceptually and visually depicts the linkages between the direct threats, the impact on the biodiversity focal points, which are really just kind of all of the terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems and species within Bluff Lake, and focusing on these, trying to prevent these stressors of, habitat loss, habitat degradation, but trying to just lay out visually the thought process through this. And this is included in the guidance document, mostly to just, again, kind of put on paper the thought process of where I went or how I got there. And following off of the situation analysis is the results chain, really trying to, again, lay out in a visual, conceptual mapping way of how a potential community science monitoring program could impact all of these different factors and kind of turn and lead to different intermediate results before kind of improving the overall health of the ecosystem. And so I was focused really on these kind of three main ideas when I was thinking about monitoring indicators and coming up with different activities that can support community science within Bluff Lake. I mean, the first one is really that main one of, coming up with more baseline data of how, what species are actually there and present and what the health of those species are, and the health mostly for the trees, but some of the vegetation, but really enable to empirically monitor, the progress over time. And so a few of the, about 6 potential community science monitoring opportunities, and this was really based off of kind of site observation, reviewing literature of what works with community science projects, as well as some conversations with the education manager, the previous site manager, and the executive director of Bluff Lake as well. But based off of all that information, came up with 6 potential opportunities that were, some are easier than others to, incorporate and start gathering data on the various ecological components. The first one would be vegetation coverage. And this was actually something that was previously done, but there are basically, at least within the prairie, they did conduct vegetation coverage of, percentage of vegetation within a certain monitoring plot. And this could be done easily really throughout the site and incorporating not only some of the youth groups that come by or field trips, but also the weed warriors that come by on a monthly basis who are already there kind of pulling, mechanically removing noxious weeds. And so they can kind of be one of the groups, one of the community groups to start measuring vegetation coverage, measuring kind of the amount of weeds that they're pulling, and maybe tracking to see if this is getting worse or getting better, and kind of adjusting the management strategies from there. But the vegetation coverage indicator can also help with identifying whether a lot more people are going off trail, or if certain areas of vegetation are getting degraded more so than others, really, especially as visitor numbers continue to increase. And then water quality, this is again something that Bluff Lake already does, but they don't really collect it in a systematic way. But they do collect water quality information specifically within Sand Creek, but this can be done within the lake as well. And I think this is just already done within summer camps and within their youth groups, that it would just need to be documented. And once it's documented, you can start looking at different patterns of the water quality between the lake and Sand Creek. And then there's biodiversity. I think Bluff Lake is really unique where it's a space where there's actually a very surprising amount of biodiversity in terms of its habitats and the actual species. But this is probably one of the easier ones to do and promote because there's so many different applications and platforms that can help you just, enter in the different species that you've identified. I think iNaturalist is probably the biggest one, and currently they already have hundreds of observations in Bluff Lake on iNaturalist because of a BioBlitz that was conducted with the city of Denver, really all around Denver a couple of years ago. But there's a number of people who continue to use iNaturalist and make observations at Bluff Lake. And there's also Seek, which is kind of a more family-friendly platform that doesn't collect personal information or personal identifying information, which might be a better way to kind of engage youth with their families. And eBird is another kind of citizen science platform for the birding community, and again, is already heavily used within Bluff Lake. So these would just be promoted, you know, with the current communities and visitors that they have now, because they already are used. But, you know, potentially there could be, to encourage more people to kind of identify species in the area, maybe conducting or hosting bioblitzes on a seasonal basis, or, you know, having certain days to try and identify or focus on certain species, and conducting trainings and how best to identify one species at a time. So there's a lot of different ways to kind of promote this for a variety of age groups. And then the tree health indicator, again, following up on the work that the previous CLTL cohort did on the tree surveys in the Cottonwood Grove, I think it would be worthwhile to continue conducting those surveys and potentially to identify and surveying other portions of the site as well. This can be conducted with some youth groups, kind of depending on the group, but would require a bit more training beforehand. But again, I think there's a lot of different potential groups that could be used that come and visit Bluff Lake. It really is kind of a great STEM educational opportunity to be involved in. But continuing to conduct those tree health surveys and expanding those to other parts of the site, and continuing to monitor the prairie dogs. Again, they already have kind of a survey and form for approximating the number of prairie dogs per acre on the land to ensure that the number is, you know, at a reasonable number given the space available. And that can also be done potentially with kind of more high school level groups, or maybe other community members or adults who are interested in doing some surveying with a little bit of training as well. And then another kind of low hanging fruit would be, and this kind of comes from the need to photograph the progress of different restoration activities, just using photo point monitoring. And this could be done with really a lot less training, where you have like a poll with a QR code and essentially instructions for someone to take a photo and submit it to the through the Google form. And so you can continuously collect and monitor different, really the same view, but with having different community members, just visitors who pass by and want to take a photo of that and can contribute that to kind of your monitoring activities. So it's just a very, very brief, very tentative monitoring schedule, I would say. But all to say that if these monitoring activities were to actually come to fruition, there would be monitoring of a number of different indicators really throughout the year. And a couple of notes on, just based off of the literature, some community science program best practices, really thinking about having clear goals and objectives, and really having a good understanding, or having the volunteers understand the connection between the activity with the conservation goal. A lot of the literature suggests that, you know, once you have that established connection, you really understand how your work is going to eventually impact kind of or work toward the conservation goal that the organization wants to work toward. There's a bit more of a commitment and a bit more of a drive to continue doing that work and continue with this monitoring process, rather than just doing it in a one-off way. And of course, the second would be sufficient training. A lot of the literature that I looked at focused on whether community science from youth could basically result in valuable or data that is high quality and actually could be used for analyzing different progress towards conservation goals. And ultimately, it can be, even with really young youth, but it does require sufficient training to ensure that you get high quality data out of their monitoring efforts. And of course, a sense of ownership over the work, really having a say and having your inputs kind of validated and recognized is an important part of the process. And opportunities to either share their work or at least sharing that information in some kind of, or disseminating that knowledge or data in some way, so that community members can see that this wasn't just data kind of collected, stored, and hoarded away, that is actually being used. And especially for youth, it can be very empowering if there were opportunities for them to share their work and how they contributed to it. So I was thinking of this more on, the level of like middle school, high school, really having that opportunity to, promote, their hands-on contributions to data collection. But just a couple of follow-up on the guidelines. This is, well, I think first it was, really important to emphasize that this is a working document. This kind of process of outlining the whole kind of situation analysis, results chains, and the potential activities. All of this is meant to serve just as a framework and a guide of, how I got to where I got, but also, as the goals for the 2021 plus strategic plan are finalized, of course, that would really change a lot of things within the activity, but it is meant to be a working document, meant to be adjusted and kind of a collaborative process with everyone at Bluff Lake. Also, obviously, there were maybe 6 potential activities for monitoring, so there's a need to prioritize which ones are most feasible. And then conducting outreach for volunteers that would be appropriate or the optimal age group for each one of these monitoring activities. Since most of the, I think, youth at Bluff Lake are still in the elementary school age, but there have been discussions of potentially expanding their reach to, try and get more middle school or high school, even high school interns to support Bluff Lake. And then just some, quick reflections. On the visitor use survey, or quick reflections of this whole capstone process, on the visitor use survey, it was much more labor intensive or time consuming than I thought it would be. I would say much less people were willing to fill out the surveys in person than I originally anticipated. But I think in-person survey, I collected less surveys than I thought I would. But at the same time, I think there is a lot of value to doing in-person surveys versus online surveys because of some of the conversations that you can get out of the end. And just some of that qualitative information that you can gather through those conversations. And then through the community science monitoring guidelines, I think one, just really the importance of having very clearly defined goals. Kind of as I was thinking about this, knowing that those strategic goals were tentative and probably going to change, it was, it made me think about how drastically that whole plan, all of the change and the activities would, all the intermediate results would change if those goals were changed as well. So. And the importance of prioritization, at the end of the day, the staff for Bluff Lake has not increased. And so it really is important to just kind of prioritize all of these different activities and all of these kind of aspirations that Bluff Lake would like to achieve. And then lastly, I think just in general, my background hasn't really been focused on urban natural areas. And I think there are just a lot of unique challenges and different considerations to think about for urban natural areas. Even as I was going through the literature review, which most of the literature out there is still heavily focused on rural areas, protected areas, and other open spaces. And I think the literature more focused on urban biodiversity conservation is a bit newer. But yeah, the thinking about that as an urban space and thinking about how, you know, maybe the conservation goals that we typically think of in more open protected spaces aren't as applicable, are applicable, but they maybe our conservation goals need to be different and more specific to urban areas. But yeah. But thank you so much for those here, as well as, you know, all of the people at Bluff Lake who really were very open to sharing materials, sharing information with me to kind of get my head around all of the information and what really delivering something that could be useful for Bluff Lake, as well as all of the CLTL professors, instructors, and cohort members that kind of supported me along the way. Yeah, happy to answer any questions.